I want to say good morning to you this morning. It is great to have you here at Stones Hill Community Church. It's good to see you. And I'm Pastor Joey, although yesterday I was leaving a graduation open house and someone said I look like Amos Bontrager. So today I'll be Pastor Amos for you. It's great to have you here. I certainly hope I'm a man's man too. And thank you, Mike Weimer, and thank you, Chad Bloss, for your work on that this morning. And I hope you are a woman's woman, right? God is good. We're looking at part two of a series wrap up, and it's a privilege to talk to you once again this morning about life and community. And I just want to begin today by saying that there's only one person worth giving up everything for. Only one. And that's exactly what he asked of you and I this morning, is to follow him. In fact, not one time did Jesus ever say, I want you to be my number one fan. I want you to cheer for me, and I want you to, get your grills and tailgate and cheer and have a great time and get your banners and celebrate and be my fan, my number one fan. In fact, he never said that one time. But what he did say, I want you to be my disciple. I want you to follow me even when no one's cheering. I want you to follow me even when there's no touchdowns to count or runs scored or aces served. I want you to follow me every step of the way. And oh, by the way, where are we going? To a cross. Do you have what it takes to follow me? And if you don't, you better count the cost, because it's not going to get any easier. And so Jesus presents this question, will you follow me? And even more specifically, will you follow me through the core values that we have presented over the last several weeks? These are priorities, we could say, for the life of any disciple, anyone who seriously wanted to follow Jesus. In fact, will you live a God-centered life? Jesus did. Someone's view of God changes for the better because of you. That's what it means to live a God-centered, God-glorifying life. Something you said, you did, your priority, the way you went about conducting your affairs, it says something about God. And what it says, if it lifts up the Lord and brings out some aspect of His beauty, then it is a God-glorifying, a God-centered, a Jesus-centered life. Will you live a Jesus-centered, God-centered life? Will you follow Jesus by being people-centered? People make mistakes in this world. They need loved and forgiven just like you and I. And Jesus is... He himself ran the risk of rejection by others just so He could demonstrate God's grace to someone who needed it in the world. If we're grudge-centered or bitterness-centered, it definitely will show in how you treat people. But if you're people-centered, they're made in the image of God, they have inestimable worth as a result of that creation, and you treat them accordingly, wow, it's a people-centered life. It's what Jesus was. And it's who Jesus was. Will you follow Jesus in how you lead and love your family? Jesus, of course, loved His parents, and He loved and cared for His siblings, being the eldest child, because Mary went on to have other children in her family. And Jesus would have fulfilled the role of the eldest child, especially the early demise of Joseph, which some surmise that he died at an early age because he drops out of the gospel record early. And so he perhaps died as a younger father, and Jesus would have had to step in and care for that family and lead that family. And will you follow Jesus in how you step in and lead and care for your family? Will you follow Him by being a great brother, a great sister, a great son or daughter, a father or mother? Will you follow Jesus? See, discipleship is not this overly spiritual, kind of wear the right label, speak the right Christianese kind of existence. It's none of those things. Look the part. Fill the roles. Hold the positions. No. He never asked those things. He said, will you follow me? And the way you can follow me is to love your family, to live a people-centered life, to live a God-centered life. Will you follow Jesus in participation and involvement? God uses a lot of things to grow you spiritually, but most often He uses another person with insights and observations that you may not have. He uses those people that can influence you for good. And the operative word here is incarnation. Jesus participated and involved Himself in our stuff down here. And when He submersed Himself into our world, He stood to change it. And the only way you can change the world for good, the only way you can reach a community for good, is to submerge yourself into it. And to be part of it. And live in community with others. And there's so many good things that you have to bring to a community. And if you never engage and participate and involve yourself in that community suffers some because your giftedness is not brought to bear upon it. Jesus incarnated. He involved Himself. Will you follow Jesus in a Bible-centered life? Will you read it, seek to understand and apply it? Will you attend a church that takes Bible exposition seriously? One of the few churches in the world who do so. Will you read the Bible books that we talk about? And will you come each week and hear it explained verse by verse and then walk out these doors and begin to live that out in your daily life and understand how it all works today? Will you be unique? Will you follow Jesus in a Bible-centered, Bible-focused life? Will you follow Jesus in community involvement and transforming cemetery places to gardens of renewal and hope? Because this area, this community that we live in is our Eden, and we are called to be caretakers of it. Will you follow Jesus in making disciples for Him? And that's where we've been here today. Making disciples. There's a final core value. And it really hinges on all the rest. In a way, it impacts all the rest. And it might begin as an ordinary relationship, but you meaningfully interact with someone and do life beside them, and then you begin to build into their lives the way of life as it's been given to us in the life and teachings of Jesus, and you're able then to impact their lives personally, one-on-one, for good. And per last week's message, these core values may involve a cross. Slide number 10. They may involve a cross. Discipleship always involves a cross, actually. On slide number 11, we looked at Luke 14:27 last week. Whoever does not carry his own cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. It's interesting because in salvation, Jesus carried the cross. And we today, we stand back and we cheer, you go Jesus, you go get him. You do it. Man, you're awesome. What a hero. What a savior for mankind. Bore the crown of thorns and the cross, the spikes through the wrist and the flagellum or the whipping of a prisoner of Rome. You endured all that stuff, and we stand on the sidelines and we say, wow, what a savior. And somewhere in all of that, the thorn-crowned brow of Jesus turns in your direction, and with swollen eyes and a bloody back, He says to you, will you follow me? You know, discipleship asks you to carry the cross of obedience. Salvation, of course, Jesus carried that cross. But discipleship is something He asks of you to do. He asks, in fact, for you to make disciples. And the only way you can make a disciple is if you are one. Because we don't want to make other fans of Jesus. We don't want to make other converts of Jesus. We want to make disciples. Fully devoted followers of Christ. So many people treat the story of Jesus as a marketing campaign. Let's make Jesus as appealing, plausible, and relevant and easy to digest as possible. And not even Jesus did that. He said, if you want to follow me, prepare to carry a cross. And when you carry the cross, it means a whole lot more than just standing on the sidelines cheering for one who did. Jesus knew things were going to get really rough in Jerusalem when He told these twin parables in Luke 14. He knew that only the most hardcore followers of Jesus would have what it would take to build a movement after His death, resurrection, and ascension. He knew that it wasn't just a fan that was going to do it. It was going to be people who understood His core values, people who understood what true followership involved. And not everyone who cheered for Him in His day was actually committed to Him. Like I said last week, there were a lot of tire kickers, a lot of spiritual folk that hung around for the miraculous. Jesus, knowing what was ahead, began to say these hard things. Like, unless you hate your mom and dad, you can't follow me. And of course, Jesus believed in loving your enemies, and so He obviously wasn't teaching hatred. What He was teaching was that unless all other loves in your life look like hate by comparison to your love relationship with me, you're not going to have what it takes to follow me. Because somebody's going to do you wrong in life, and you're going to have a decision to make. Are you going to obsess over that for the rest of your life? Or are you going to lay yourself down on a cross, be spiked there, and go on with your God-glorifying, God-centered life? That's a decision you're going to have to make. And He understood it. And so He told these stories to amplify the meaning of discipleship. And He told the first story so that we would count the cost of following, so that when the whip starts cracking and the blood starts flying in Jerusalem and people start betraying and health starts to deteriorate and people start acting weird because they didn't get their way, when everything around you feels more like a cross than a blessing. He told this first story so that you'd be prepared to count the cost for the long haul. And come what may, you're going to finish what you start. There, your life will be no half tower, half done, half undone, sitting in the middle of a field with money tied up and invested in now something that's at this point totally unusable. You did not count the cost. You wasted so many resources because you refused to count the cost. Your life is not going to end like that. And Jesus says a disciple has to adopt a mentality that says, no, I'm going to finish this thing. I'm going to finish. I talked about Bonhoeffer last week. And what you guys don't realize this morning is that there may come a time in all of your lives when you all will be invited to be a Bonhoeffer. It may not be as far off as you think it is. This week, that was last week. This week, we look at discipleship from a slightly different perspective. The second story asks us to consider the cost of not following. Last week, we talked about the cost of following. It will cost you something. That cross is rugged. It's splintery. It's uninviting. It's tough to lay yourself down on that thing and die. But this morning, as a second part to the closing of this series, we look at a slightly different angle on the topic of discipleship and a serious closing here this morning. I have to ask you the question, have you ever considered the cost of not following Christ? Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever stopped to think what your life might become if you persistently refuse to follow Jesus in fully devoted discipleship? You see, this second story, Jesus used something that has commonly occurred down through history. He uses the motif of kings at war. Slide number 12, verse 31. Or what king, he says, going out to confront another king in battle, will not sit down first and determine whether he is able with 10,000 to face the one coming against him with 20,000 soldiers? You see, the kings are ready to march. In fact, one of them is already riding in full battle array with a huge army. Time is of the essence. And when these two armies collide with each other, it's going to be pandemonium. And so a decision has to be made. Verse 32. If he cannot succeed, he will send out a representative, while the other is still a long way off, and ask for terms of peace. My mind conjures up a lot of movies that I've seen where the representative, the army that sends the representative out to the other army, who's usually coming in full battle array at a gallop speed, and they're really ticked over being challenged. And so this one lesser king and army will send out an emissary or a representative, and the opening scene of Gladiator with Russell Crowe is forever burned in my memory. I'd hate to be that representative dude that the Romans sent over to negotiate with the barbarian Germanic hordes. And this guy he's hairy. In fact, I think I got a picture of him on there. He's kind of a hairy looking dude. He's rough. He's wearing furs. And he yells over, he's wielding an axe, and he yells over to the Romans, "Here says Verfuncta Hunda."
They say no.
And I've got that burned in my memory. Every now and then in pastoral work, I want to look at some challenging problem and stand up and say, "Er said verfuncta hunda." Okay? We're going to stand. We're going to make a stand here. This is important, worth fighting for, and we've got to make a stand. A lot of times, though, if you watch that movie, you understand they did something really nasty to the representative or emissary that they had sent over to make terms of peace. It wasn't pretty. And so this heightens the urgency of the kings at war story that Jesus tells here, because they knew how this goes. The kings knew and understood how this would normally go. And realizing the urgency of the hour and the barbarian hordes on the way that were bent on destruction, Jesus understood that a smart king, an outnumbered king, would hasten to a decision and dispatch messengers or a messenger in hopes that he could negotiate terms of peace. Jesus noted in the story that this king was outnumbered 2-1 on the battlefield. Now, it wouldn't take me long to realize, that those are not very good odds. 20,000 versus 10,000, or 10,000 versus 1,000. Okay? Or 10,000 versus 5,000. The odds are 2-1. And it wouldn't take long for the military advisors to realize that maybe sending out a representative would be the smart thing to do in this situation, because this guy's got us outnumbered 2-1. And Jesus said if the king is wise, he'll send out a delegation to discuss terms of peace. Now listen to me. The longer the king puts this decision off, the closer he gets to complete disaster. The king's ride in full battle array. The conflict's going to happen. Something has to intervene, or this is going to be cataclysmic. The king has to decide right away what he's going to do. He has to decide if he's going to keep resisting or not. He has to assess his position and resources and to ensure that they're adequate. He has to weigh the advantages and disadvantages. Can we win this thing with a minimal loss of life? Can we still have our wives and family and children if we engage this barbarian king in battle? Do we have a chance? What say you? To his military advisors. It's never easy to be in a leadership position because your decisions impact so many, and this king certainly understands it. And Jesus says that a wise, smart king, realizing his most disadvantageous position, is going to do something extraordinary. He's going to send out a representative, swallow his pride, and send out a representative that will offer terms of peace. And the way Jesus sets this up is meant to convey a truth. You understand, he's on his way to Jerusalem. It's going to get nasty in Jerusalem. And he conveys this in such a way that he communicates that the king who is making this decision on what to do, who's outnumbered 2-1, he's making this decision on what to do. He doesn't have limitless time to ponder. He must weigh the risk. He must make his choice. He must live with the consequences. But decide he must. Because time is of the essence. If he delays in making a decision, he will have a fight whether he wants one or not. And if battle means defeat for him and the loss of his village or town and city and the loss of the women and children and families, then delaying to seek peace would be catastrophic and foolish for a king outnumbered 2-1. The master's point is well taken here in this second of two parabolic twins. You see, what is he saying? He says it's imperative that you make a decision right away about who you are going to follow, because your entire life direction is at stake. The longer you put this off, the longer you refuse to forgive, the longer you refuse to fully devote yourself to followership, the longer you refuse to lay down on a cross and die to yourself and all of your ambitions, the longer you put it off, the closer you get to tragedy at worst and an unfinished life at best. And so remember, friends, Jesus is going to die in a few weeks in Jerusalem. He knows it. And if they didn't call or nail this discipleship thing down now, this master thing down now, they might not ever follow him, because it was only going to get rougher the longer they went on their journey. Time was of the essence. Persecutions are going to break out. Executions will commence. The blood will start splattering. The whips will start cracking. Time is of the essence. Jesus is saying, if you don't choose to follow me now, you may live your life, all of your life, refusing to follow me. Unless you draw a line in the sand and say, I will follow, that day may never come. You see, to not follow Jesus in fully devoted discipleship is to go against His way of life. Think about it. If you're not following Him and His way of thinking, then you're following someone else's way of thinking. And we will all pay dearly for choosing any other path besides the Jesus path and what He taught. I looked at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, as a case in point this week. What is the Sermon on the Mount in reverse? We could throw that gear shift into reverse and floor the gas. What would life be like if we just inverted all of those life principles that Jesus gave us to live by in this incredible sermon? Well, if we inverted everything, you know what we would have? We would have hearts full of murder and hate. We'd have revenge and getting even as our center value. We'd have minds consumed by lust and pornography. We'd have divorce and broken families. Life in reverse is a life full of extramarital affairs. It's a life where relationships are plagued by evasiveness and deception. It's a life where judging and being suspicious of others characterizes your every daily experience of living. It's a life where people are leveraged and manipulated to get what they want. It's a life where people are dedicated, and even for an entire lifetime, to the accumulation of personal wealth. You see, last week, the all-important question was, will you count the cost and follow Jesus? And this week, the question is, can you live with all the stuff that's going to be in your life if you choose not to follow beginning today? Every day that you delay the decision of who is going to be the master of your life is one day closer to all of the above. The kings ride. They're in battle array. The battle is going to be to the strong, and it's going to be a cataclysmic clashing of two worlds. And you're going to suffer to lose so much because you chose to not make a decision about following Him. Dallas Willard, who's gone to be with the Lord, says, and I quote him, "Non-discipleship costs abiding peace, a life penetrated throughout by love, faith that sees everything in light of God's governance, hopefulness that stands firm in the most discouraging of circumstances, power to do what is right and withstand the forces of evil." Can I talk straight with you a little bit? Can this Pastor Amos Bontrager speak some truth into your life this morning? If you don't follow Jesus in fully devoted discipleship, it's going to cost you. Either way, on either side of that equation. If you don't follow, you'll pay it on the other side. If you count the cost and follow, yeah, you'll have to go through some tough stuff and give up your right to get even and things like that. We all think that's a luxury. You'll have to give that up. But it'll pay you on the other side in good ways. Okay? And if you don't follow Jesus in fully devoted discipleship, it's going to cost you. You'll be addicted to pornography by the time you're 18. And then you'll try to convince a woman that she should marry you in your addicted state. If you won't follow Jesus, you'll be a grudge-holding person and a grudge-holding family. And what are you going to do when your own kids start holding their grudges against you? They're just doing what you always showed them to do. And if you won't follow Jesus, You'll live for pleasure alone, and a divorce, or maybe a couple divorces later, along with a couple of children by different women whom you're not married to at the present time, and maybe even a possible stint in rehab. It's amazing how all that pleasure sours in your stomach. There is such an incredible cost for not following. And if you don't follow Jesus, you'll open your life up to sexual experimentation, and you'll do things with people of both genders that will rob you of your decency, dignity, and health. If you won't follow Jesus, you'll check out on the important issues of life that need discussed with your children, and when they leave home, they will go berserk because they're rudderless in the cultural storm because you had no value system to impart to them. Jesus wasn't it. Friends, let's think about all this from the standpoint of our core values. Have you counted the cost of not being God-centered or Jesus-centered? Slide number 2. If you make anything else central in life besides God, your false gods will come crashing down, and they will demand that you pay a price. It will be a price of disappointment. If you say, I'll obey Jesus if my career thrives. I'll follow Jesus in fully devoted discipleship if I get the home run. If my health is good. If I get a raise. If I get the job. If I get the house. If my family is together. Then I'll follow Christ. Then the thing that's on the other side of that if is your master. Christ isn't. That is. And I have to tell you that Jesus will not be a means to an end. He will not be used like that. If you are not Jesus-centered, then something else is your center. And what's on the other side of your if? Is it a person? Or what happens when this person chooses someone to love beside you? Is it an experience? Well, what happens and who pays the bills when the buzz finally wears off? And how many parenting discipleship opportunities will you have forfeited while achieving the buzz and the fixes of life? Is it an image on the other side of that if? I only have worth if I have a particular look or body image. Well, what do you do when babies leave you stretched and middle age turns you gray and you snap and crackle and pop when you get out of the chair? It's crazy. My ankles are ridiculous. Snap and crackle and pop. I need ace bandages or something. It's just ridiculous. Getting old is crazy. Well, what's on the other side of your if? If I'll obey you, Jesus, if. Is it work? What are you going to do when your job is terminated and your investments tank or they push you into early retirement? Is it sport? Life only has meaning and I only have worth if my team is winning. But what are you going to do if your team loses? What are you going to do if injury takes you out of the game permanently? What are you going to live for then? Pastor Amos talking a little straight talk. Is it politics? Life only has meaning and I only have worth if my ideas or candidate is winning? Well, what happens when your political party loses? Or your man or woman disgraces the office with constant deception and anti-Jesus views of life? Who are you loyal to then? Have you counted the cost of not living a God-centered life? If you are God-centered, relationships matter more than grudges. Family is more important than money. A deep respect by those closest to you is more important than image from those who are distant. If you are God-centered, having a warm personal relationship with the Son is more important than winning a game or getting a scholarship. A lovely daughter who represents Jesus is more important than a stretch mark, a retirement plaque, or a championship ring. When God is your center, everything else is free to play the lesser role it should be playing in your life. And you'll be free to enjoy a lot of these things as a fully devoted follower of Jesus, but you'll stay strong in your followership even when these things are withdrawn from your life. Even when love is withdrawn from your life or other expectations disappear from your life, you'll stay strong in your followership because you're basing your followership on something so much more. Have you counted the cost of not being people-centered? Slide 3. If not, you probably will live a grudge-centered, bitter-infested life. And we'll look at your picture in about 30 years. It'll be like that picture they had on the Bible. You know, you had the president, and then the picture that the guy that played the enemy in the Bible, and it's like, man, this guy aged like 30 years. It'll be like that. Your eyes will be narrow and your face will be wrinkled, and you'll be walking around snap, crackling, and popping, and you'll still be talking about the raw deal that nobody ever wants to hear anyway. Have you considered the cost of not being people-centered? Can you live with the poor health, the lost sleep, and the constant pressure to get your pound of flesh, where you always have to be alert to opportunities to get even? It's such exhausting work, and some are dedicated to the task. Have you counted the cost of not being people-centered? Slide 4, have you counted the cost of not being family-centered? Can you live with yourself and come to that graduation day of pomp and circumstance and look into the eyes of your son or daughter and realize you never once took an effort or made a consistent effort to invest and disciple them and invest in them as young men and young women? And now you have created a home life that's so horrific that they can't wait to graduate and get out of it because home has been nothing but fighting and anger and conflict. Can you live with yourself knowing that your kids grew up in that kind of home environment because you chose never to get on a cross and never to suffer for the family? It was always about you. And now your kids can't stand to come home because home represents so much pain. Can you live with that? Is that the life you want? Have you counted the cost of not living a participant-centered life? I have to hasten. Have you counted the cost, number 6, slide 6, of not living a Bible-centered life? Some insight that you need to get through a messy conflict or situation. You would have had it if you would have just come to church and watched the Word unfold every week. You would have had the key you needed to unlock the puzzle if you'd just been faithful to be a Bible-centered person in your life. To parent well, you need a Bible-centered life. To do apologetics across the fence with your skeptical neighbor, you need a Bible-centered life. To ensure that your one life is lived for all the right reasons, you need a Bible that organizes and presents priorities and core values. Have you counted the cost of not living a community-centered life? Slide 7. Can you live with a dark cloud that seems to descend over an area where people live just for themselves and nothing more? Can you live with that? Slide 8, have you counted the cost of not living a disciple-centered life? You never bothered to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus. You never bothered to disciple your boys or daughters in that life. You kind of coasted along from Bud Light to Bud Light in the garage. And all these deep conversations never happened because you never made it out of the garage. Can you live with that? Friends, have you counted the cost of not following? Jesus wants to be the all-consuming center point of your passion and pursuit. And if He isn't, you must count the cost of what it's going to cost you if you refuse Him that place in your life. And I have to tell you, the war is nearby. The spiritual war, the King's ride. The hour is late. You must decide. The builder of the tower was free to build or not. It's his choice. If he wants to count the cost and go for it, it's his choice, but there will be cost and there will be a measure of shame in an unfinished life. And Jesus lets these guys know that on His way to the cross. If you guys don't count the cost, you're going to go home with your tail tucked between your legs, and everybody's going to wonder what happened to that Jesus enterprise you left everything for. If you don't count the cost now, you're not going to have what it takes to still be following years from now. And then the second story. The story of the king being invaded. It reveals a king who must do something or face incredible consequences. And friends, you owe it to yourself. Calculate with me this morning what it's going to cost you if you go another day without fully, devotedly following Him. Do the math. I tried to do a few little math equations for you this morning to try to help create the picture for you to do the calculations and to see what it might cost you. But this morning, time is of the essence. Every day that you delay His absolute lordship over your life is one day closer to the battle of life battles and to the destruction and to the reversal of Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount in your life. The question this morning is, will you follow Him? I close the message with a remarkable discipleship story. It's about a guy by the name of Telemachus. Telemachus lived in the early 400s AD. He was a guy like a lot of us. He searched for truth. He searched for life purpose. He searched for life meaning. He even did a study tour that took him to many places in the world. But Telemachus found himself sucked into the world of indulgence. And after wandering around aimlessly for several years, trying to find meaning in pleasure and excitement, he eventually had an epiphany and he converted to Christ. He became a follower of Jesus. He became a monk because in the Middle Ages, that's kind of what you would do if you were serious about discipleship. Not everyone did, but many did. He became a monk and lived in a monastery. He lived kind of in a remote village. He tended the garden. He raised vegetables for the monastery kitchen. He spent a lot of time in prayer and Bible reading and all the spiritual disciplines that we would really are good for any fully devoted disciple of Jesus to do. Take time to grow yourself interiorly. Take time to spiritually formulate inside what needs to be there in order to have what it takes to follow for a lifetime. He did all those things. Telemachus heard the voice of God one day. At least it was an impression telling him to go to Rome, which was considered the cultural hub and capital of the world. Rome was, at this time, the busiest, wealthiest, biggest city of the time. even though at the time of Telemachus' life there were major deteriorations, and eventually Rome falls right after the story that I'm sharing here about his life. But all roads in his day seem to lead to Rome. And so Telemachus obediently hears that voice, he obediently follows through, and he heads out on foot for the mighty empire of Rome. He left the monastery and he began his trek. And weary weeks later, Telemachus arrived in the city at the time of a great festival of some sort. He hadn't been to the big city, especially this kind of city. And when he arrived, it was bustling with excitement. There was some kind of recent Roman victory, and the people were in celebration over this victory. And in the midst of all of this jubilant commotion, the monk Telemachus, he looked for clues. All right, God, here I am now. Why'd you bring me here? Give me some sign, some insight as to why I heard your voice, came to Rome. Here I am. Here's what's going on. What do you ask of me to do? Maybe use these details to give me guidance. And so he just kind of follows the crowd. And he lets them guide him. And the stream of humanity soon led him into the Colosseum, where the gladiatorial contests were to be staged that day in this great fanfare and celebration. The crowd was immense. It was excited. Again, pandemonium. And Telemachus just kind of let the crowds guide him. And he could hear the cries, slide 14, he could hear the cries of the animals in their cages beneath the floor of the great arena, and the clamor of the contestants preparing to do battle that day. He goes in, the crowd just kind of goes with the crowd, and it flows into this Colosseum, and he takes his seat, and he couldn't have missed the emperor sitting in the seat of honor that day. And he most certainly would have not missed the arrival of the gladiators into the Colosseum. And as the gladiators lined up on this day that Telemachus was in attendance, this little rural monk who had made his journey to Rome, he looks down and they're lined up, these gladiators, below the emperor's seat. And they stood and they yelled out, as they always did, "We who are about to die salute you," to the emperor. It was that traditional greeting they always gave. And in an instant, Telemachus knew what he had gotten himself into for the first time in his life. He had heard about violence, perhaps had premonitions about violence of this type, but never had attended and really didn't know much about it. The crowd had come to cheer men who, for no reason other than amusement, would murder each other in front of these hordes of people. Human lives were offered for entertainment. And Telemachus the monk shuddered. He had never, ever been at one of these deals. It's interesting because Rome was already spiraling downward by the time Telemachus arrived there. The Roman politicians gave the people free bread and soup, and they provided the circuses and gladiatorial games as a means of distraction and bribery. They had outdoor drama featuring the taboo and forbidden, chariot races that kept the people entertained. These things were designed to keep the masses amused and distracted and preoccupied. Temples and gods, baths, flutes, exotic prisoners of war, savagery, spectacle. This was Rome. The poor and criminal vastly outnumbered the rich of Rome, and their lives seemed expendable. And when the foreign invaders from the north finally arrived in Rome a few years after the story of Telemachus that I'm in the middle of telling you, these barbaric Germanic hordes just walked into the city in 410 AD, and there was no one left to defend it because they had spent themselves on their pleasures. No one had a will to fight anymore. Orgies and erotic spectacles of many kinds. Homosexuality was rampant, bestiality among the nobility. Imported dancers and from exotic lands. Rome had no will to resist, to struggle, to fight anymore. And they eventually just were overwhelmed. And it was near the end of that history, though, that this monk, Telemachus, found himself in a coliseum on a day when men were going to fight to the death. It's interesting because gladiators, most of whom were accused criminals or prisoners of war, would fight to the death. And this is how the gladiatorial games began. They would let criminals condemned to die slug it out. If they're going to die, and they're going to die anyway, let's let them fight it out for the entertainment of the crowd. That's how it got its start. Some of the victims, though, it evolved. And some of the victims were not just murderers and brigands and criminals sentenced for death. It involved prisoners of war or maybe rebellious subjects of Rome. And since they were sentenced to die anyway, again, they would just allow them to fight to the death, and the last man standing would live to fight and see another day. But eventually it evolved and morphed into this kind of sports deal where there were different types of gladiators, some of them more athletic and muscular, who could hold their own. And the emperors and the wealthy got control of this, and it took off. The gladiatorial contest became a part of the culture. The fighters were dying way too quickly, and the people wanted to watch more. The hacking and slashing might kill someone in a few seconds, but the people, the fans, they wanted to watch a competition that would last between 15 and 20 minutes rather than just a 30-second killing. And so they began to outfit these gladiators with helmets and shields and jackets of mail to protect them and to prolong the battle. But it wasn't too elaborate. These shields and things weren't too elaborate because the crowd was anxious and thirsty to see ripped flesh and deep gashes in bodies and wounds in arms and legs and the flowing of blood. And they would construct these huge coliseums to accommodate the growing crowds. They had compartments, as you can see. They had compartments below the sand-covered floor so that the wild animal or a gladiator could be lifted up at random times in the arena during the contest and thus heighten the excitement of the battle. The idea grew and investors got involved, and they began to invest money in gladiators, and people began to cheer for them like we kind of do our sports heroes today. And if you lost one of them to battle, it was a heavy financial loss. And so there was vested interest in getting yourself outfitted and be skilled so you could survive in the gladiatorial arena. The gladiatorial games became institutionalized. And you might even have a guy that would own a whole team of gladiators. And he would hire them out at special festivals and things. You could rent the whole team and watch them fight with other gladiators to the finish. It's what ancient Rome cheered for. And then at random times, even like our half times or quarters between our contest, they would maybe have a prisoner to be brought out in the middle of the arena, and he would be executed or have a body part amputated. Or maybe starving lions would be released just for halftime entertainment. Into this climate walked this little monk named Telemachus. You roll the video. Telemachus shuddered at what he saw. The gladiators that day pulled their weapons, and the bloody brawl began just a short distance away from Telemachus. The grotesque nature of the sport appalled this young monk. Worse yet, it was the reactions of those around him. The spectators were in a bloodthirsty ecstasy. They cheered and they ranted and they raved over what they were seeing. Telemachus was sickened by it. He was shocked by it. And then that instant, he realized that it must stop, and he couldn't sit still and watch such savagery, and neither could he get up and leave and forget about what he had experienced. He jumped to the top of the perimeter wall and he cried, "In the name of Christ, forbear." Telemachus cried out several more times, "In the name of Christ, Forbear, it's a 4th century way of saying stop. Forbear means stop. In the name of Christ, stop. In the name of Christ, stop. In the name of Christ, stop this madness. What are you people thinking here in Rome? No one paid the slightest attention to this puny little voice that was rising up at the perimeter of the Colosseum sand floor wall. They just ignored this guy in the frenzy of the moment. And so Telemachus would not be stopped, and he pattered down the stone steps, and he leapt onto the sandy floor of the arena, and it was kind of like a comic figure had been interjected into the brawl, a scrawny man in a monk's garb, dashing back and forth between muscular, well-armed, athletic men. And the gladiators were surprised by this little guy who had the audacity to step into the arena. And it was kind of comical, and they thought it was part of the show. Him rushing back and forth, trying to stop the fighting, back and forth between the warriors. In the name of Christ, stop, he yelled over and over again. And one gladiator sent him sprawling with a blow from his shield and directed him back to his seat. It was a rough gesture, though almost a kind one. And the crowd roared. But Telemachus refused to stop. He rushed into the way of those trying to fight even more. He shouted again and again, in the name of Christ, forbear. They laughed and they cheered. Telemachus eventually blocked the vision of one of the contestants, and he just about got a fatal blow because of Telemachus being in the way. He sees the blow coming just in time, and now he's furious. And the crowd begins to cry out for the interloper's blood. Run him through. Run him through. The gladiator he had blocked raised his sword, and with a flash of steel struck Telemachus, slashing him down across his chest and into his stomach. And what happened after that seems to be unclear and inconclusive. There may have been stones thrown as well, according to some of the resources I consulted. And a few others followed Telemachus into the arena, and a mob fight broke out. But when the dust cleared, there lay Telemachus on the ground, the little monk's dying gasp. In the name of Christ, stop. He had been slain. And then a strange thing occurred. As the two gladiators and the crowd focused on the still form of the suddenly crimson sand, the arena grew deathly quiet. And in the silence, someone in the top tier got up and walked out. Another followed. All over the arena, spectators began to leave until the huge Roman stadium was emptied. And all that remained in that giant Colosseum was the scrawny, lifeless body of Telemachus. There were other forces at work, of course, but that innocent figure lying in the pool of blood crystallized the opposition, and that was the beginning of the end of the gladiatorial contest in the Roman Colosseum. Within 40 years, the games were entirely over, and Rome itself as a culture had fallen. Like Telemachus, there are many today whose hearts are pierced for the afflicted. And when I say you have to consider the cost of following Jesus and you have to consider the cost of not following Jesus, it may involve a number of things in your life. It may be that there's a cry of forbearance that is issued forth for the little ones who are destroyed in the womb and left to die at the moment of birth. In the name of Christ, stop this. They cry out, these voiceless ones, even though presidents and politicians try to silence their cry. They cry out in a Telemachus-like voice for those who are being warped and damaged by internet pornography. They cry out at schools where safe sex and sodomy is endorsed and funded by government gone awry. They cry out for the sacredness of marriage between male and female only, despite the daily media barrage that pounds away daily against the teachings of Christ. Scorned and ignored, these valiant ones plead before magistrates in legal context on behalf of the innocent. They speak against no-fault divorce. They speak against expanded gambling. They speak against free needles for addicts. They speak against sex ed programs that serve to up contraceptives and abortions to children without parental involvement. In the name of Christ, forbear. Some have gone global in their Telemachus-like cry. Some cry out for the persecution of Christians to stop in Egypt and Iran. Some cry out to end the sex trade of Asia for girls who are not even teenagers. Some cry out for clean water in Africa, for traditional marriage in America and France now, and for the protection of young Muslim girls that are the victims of honor killings in Jordan. Some cry out for the Scriptures to be heard, for their truthfulness to be revealed and explained, and relevance realized, and for the worldview that the Scriptures espouse. Some cry out on a daily, a weekly basis in a Telemachus-like voice. In the name of Christ, forbear. What life arena awaits your loving presence, your active involvement, your voice of forbearance? Isn't it time to enter the arena? It doesn't mean you go on TV and jump up and down and scream about all the things you're against in life. That's not discipleship. But it does mean that you will bring a biblical worldview to every topic, a Jesus-centered worldview to every issue. It does mean that you have found a master in Jesus, and it's in His name that dignity and honor and hope for the world may come. And you're going to represent Him and His value system to the world in all the various vocations that you may choose. And you're going to start by being a fully devoted follower today. Friends, the hour is late. The King's ride. You're outnumbered. And if you keep resisting, mightn't you find yourself fighting against the very Savior who came to die for you? If you keep saying no to fully devoted followership, mightn't this world be invaded someday with King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who will definitely outnumber the people of this world 2-1 easily? Mightn't you find yourself aligned with a kingdom and a battle and a king whose value system is contrary to he who is the coming king? The King's ride. The armor's clicking and clashing. A decision must be made. It must be made now. Time is of the essence. Don't wait. It's going to cost you deeply if you go one more day without a full devoted followership commitment in your life. Once again, the hour is late, and so we're going to wrap up here this morning. I'm just going to usher an appeal to the class of 2013. Won't you lead the way? With a Telemachus voice, why don't you lead the way? Maybe we'll follow some of you down into the arena of life. You battled out there. Some great cause. We will stand with you. Class of 2013, why don't you just stand right where you are? Class of 2013, just stand right where you're at today. I'm just going to pray a prayer for you. Yes? We're going to pray for you guys today. God will use your life. It's time to get in the arena. Let's pray. Thank you, God, for this day. Thank you for Telemachus. He could have sat safely in the confines of a monastery garden, raised flowers, which are beautiful and deserve to be raised, cooked food, which is good and deserves to be eaten, talked to his fellow monks, which is conversation is good and deserves to happen. But he made a decision to follow Jesus into something he did not know how it would go. And he gave his life, and in doing so turned the tide and distilled the opposition in such a way that something was changed because he obeyed. I pray you would put a Telemachus-like blessing on these graduates of 2013. Bless them as they go forth from this place next week as they are honored more formally here at Stones Hill. I pray your blessings on them. And I pray for college graduates. I pray for those here among us who've sat in the garden for too long. It's time to engage in fully devoted discipleship. God grant that we would all be, this day, this moment, your follower and yours alone. I will not follow if. No. I will follow because He is the Master. He is my Master. And I surrender to Him today. In Jesus' name, amen.